Worried about not having enough? Listen to this story. In a lush green farm, surrounded by hills and rivers, lived a young pig named Paul. Paul had everything he could wish for: his cozy sty, plenty of food, and a cool patch of shade where he could lounge each afternoon. But Paul wasn't content. Unlike the other animals who seemed perfectly at ease, Paul often gazed beyond the fences, wondering if there was something more grand in store for him. He dreamed of a life beyond the farm, a place filled with more excitement, where he could shine brighter than the others. Paul saw himself as someone destined for greatness, convinced that his simple life on the farm was far too ordinary for his grand ambitions. Paul spent many hours observing the other animals. He watched the ducks splashing freely in the pond and envied the way they glided on the water with such ease. He admired the majestic horse galloping across the fields, its mane flowing in the breeze, a sight that seemed far more thrilling than his daily routine. Even the chickens, clucking and scratching the earth, seemed to have a purpose he found lacking in his own life. He began to see his daily meals of corn and vegetables, his cozy pen, and his simple comforts as unworthy of someone with his vision. The more he watched, the more he believed he was meant for something more. As his restlessness grew, Paul found himself daydreaming about a world beyond the farm. He imagined being cherished and admired, living a life filled with luxury and splendor. His heart began to yearn for these imagined possibilities, and he started seeing his current life as a prison of routine and insignificance. This longing for something more stirred a deep dissatisfaction in Paul, leading him to believe that the farm could no longer offer him the future he desired. He looked at his muddy sty, once a place of comfort, now a symbol of all the things he felt were holding him back. Unaware of how his longing was changing him, Paul began to distance himself from the other animals. He stopped playing with the ducklings, who loved to splash him with water. He brushed past the chickens without acknowledging their friendly clucks. He even stopped greeting the wise old goat who had once shared stories of his own youthful adventures. Paul started to feel superior to his friends, thinking that one day he would rise above them all and prove his worth. Little did he know, the path he imagined might bring him admiration would soon teach him an unexpected lesson about where true wealth lies. As time went on, Paul's dissatisfaction only deepened. Each day he would look around and see his simple life as less and less appealing, longing for a world that felt just beyond his reach. The ducks that once seemed content to him now looked like they were swimming in luxury, and even the old goat stories began to seem dull and outdated to him. Paul imagined himself in places beyond the farm's borders, experiencing new adventures and being treated as something special, someone important. One afternoon, as he watched the tall horse trotting elegantly across the fields, Paul sighed heavily. "Why do I have to live this ordinary life?" he wondered aloud. "There must be something greater waiting for me out there. Surely I'm not meant to stay here forever." His heart throbbed with an aching sense of purpose that only seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Around this time, a wealthy traveler came to visit the farm, bringing an air of mystery and excitement. The man spoke of grand places, faraway lands, and exquisite animals he had collected from around the world. His stories made Paul's heart race, and Paul couldn't resist thinking that he might just be the kind of animal the traveler would want. It seemed like destiny. Perhaps this man was here to rescue him from his plain life and whisk him away to a world of wealth and admiration. Emboldened by this hope, Paul began devising a plan to catch the traveler's attention. He started to avoid the muddy patches he once loved to roll in, trying to keep himself as spotless as possible. He turned his snout up at the usual slop the farmer gave him, thinking that someone of his newfound status should have finer things. The other animals noticed his change in behavior, whispering among themselves. Paul heard some of their remarks, but he ignored them. They couldn't understand his dreams, he told himself. The ducks quacked with concern, wondering why Paul no longer came to play, and the old goat shook his head, muttering that Paul was forgetting the value of a life well lived. Yet Paul was undeterred, his thoughts consumed with visions of being noticed and chosen by the wealthy traveler. Every day he watched and waited, hoping the traveler would come to his pen and see the special pig that Paul believed himself to be. He longed for the moment when he'd be taken away from the ordinary life he so despised. But as the days passed, the traveler remained indifferent to Paul, hardly glancing in his direction. And as Paul grew more obsessed with trying to impress, he started to lose interest in his own needs. The comforts of his pen, his friendships, and even his own health were slipping away unnoticed. Paul had become a stranger to his own life, driven by a desire he could barely understand but could no longer ignore. One morning, as Paul was busy trying to clean himself up yet again, he heard the familiar sound of the traveler's voice outside his pen. Excitement surged through him. Maybe today would be the day. Paul stood tall, puffing out his chest and holding his head high, hoping to finally catch the traveler's eye. But as the man passed by, he didn't stop, didn't even turn to look. Instead, he continued on, speaking with the farmer about another animal altogether. Paul's heart sank. After all his efforts, he hadn't been noticed at all. Crushed by the disappointment, Paul wandered aimlessly around his pen, feeling the weight of all his hopes collapse around him. Everything he had imagined, the admiration, the luxurious life, seemed to drift further out of reach. And then the doubts began to creep in. Was he simply not special enough? Was he destined to live this ordinary life forever? In the following days, Paul's attempts to stand out grew even more desperate. He stopped eating his food, telling himself that a life of glamour required sacrifices. But as the days passed, his body grew weaker, and his once shiny coat became dull. The other animals, noticing his condition, tried to reach out to him. The ducks waddled over, offering him a splash from the pond to cool him down. The chickens clucked sympathetically, and even the wise old goat offered him a few encouraging words. But Paul, still lost in his fantasy of luxury, dismissed their concerns. "You just don't understand," he muttered, turning away from their worried faces. Soon, though, Paul's health began to fail him. His stomach ached from hunger, and his legs felt wobbly as he tried to stand. Even the once refreshing mud now felt cold and uncomfortable beneath him. The world around him, once so familiar and comforting, began to seem strange and distant. The comforts he'd taken for granted were fading, and his pen, his home, felt empty and lifeless. One evening, after a long day of ignoring his meals and distancing himself from his friends, Paul stumbled back to his pen, feeling more exhausted than ever. He collapsed onto the cool earth, his breath coming in slow, painful gasps. A chilling realization washed over him. He was weaker than he had ever been, isolated and lost in his pursuit of something that had never been real. As night fell, Paul lay alone under the stars, feeling small and abandoned. In the silence, the weight of his own choices became clear. His chase for admiration and luxury had led him to neglect everything that truly mattered: his friends, his health, and the simple joys that had once filled his life. For the first time, Paul began to question if he had been wrong all along. And in that lonely, quiet night, he felt a twinge of regret, wondering if he had traded something precious for an illusion. As dawn broke, Paul remained motionless in his pen, feeling the lingering ache of the previous night's regret. The warm morning light filled the farm, but he felt none of its comfort. His once rosy dreams of a grand life seemed hollow now, yet he struggled to make sense of what he truly wanted. All he knew was the emptiness left from distancing himself from everything that had once mattered. Weak and disheartened, Paul looked around at the familiar sights he had come to dismiss: the old oak tree's branches swaying gently, the sunlight sparkling on the pond, and the warm, earthy smell of his pen. These once felt like ordinary details, Yet now they brought a strange sense of comfort. He had seen these things every day, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet appreciation for them. Suddenly, he was interrupted by a soft voice. The wise old goat had wandered over to Paul's pen, his eyes filled with both concern and understanding. The goat stood silently for a moment, observing the worn look on Paul's face, before speaking in his slow, thoughtful way. "You've been looking so hard for something else, Paul," the goat said, "that you've forgotten the value of what you already have." Paul lowered his gaze, ashamed. "But I thought I was meant for more," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "I wanted to be admired, to have a better life, to be special." The goat nodded, unfazed. "It's natural to wonder what else the world has to offer, Paul," he replied gently. "But chasing after an idea of what might be, while ignoring what's right in front of you, often leads us astray. True happiness, you see, doesn't come from being admired by strangers. It's about finding peace in who you are and appreciating the life you have." Paul felt a pang in his heart. For the first time, he was able to see the truth in the old goat's words. He had been so focused on trying to be something more that he had forgotten to enjoy the life he already had, a life where he was cared for, fed, and surrounded by friends. How much time had he wasted chasing an illusion, pushing away those who truly cared for him? The goat's voice softened even further. "There is no shame in being humble, Paul. Humility teaches us gratitude, and gratitude, it helps us see the true richness in our lives." With a kind look, the goat gave Paul a gentle nod and slowly walked back to the others, leaving Paul to reflect on his words. As Paul watched the goat's calm, steady steps, he felt something change within him. The words lingered in his mind, filling the empty spaces left by his past regrets. A sense of peace began to bloom in his heart, reminding him of the warmth of friendships and the simple joys he had overlooked. For the first time in weeks, Paul felt he was beginning to understand where true wealth might really lie. Paul spent the rest of that day in quiet reflection, absorbing the old goat's words and trying to see his life through a different lens. The once trivial moments, like the duck's playful splashes, the chickens scratching and pecking in the dirt, and the gentle breeze that rustled through his pen, now felt like treasures he had overlooked. He began to realize how much he had taken for granted, and with each passing thought, a growing sense of gratitude replaced his old discontent. Later that afternoon, as Paul was lying quietly in his pen, the gentle hen Gertrude waddled over, her eyes filled with a familiar kindness. She had been watching him from a distance, concerned for the friend who had once brought so much laughter to the farm. Sensing Paul's change in demeanor, she perched herself nearby and clucked softly, offering a reassuring presence. "Paul," she began gently, "you've seemed different lately. We've all noticed and we were worried about you." She paused, studying his tired face. "I hope you're beginning to see that none of us need anything grand or flashy to be happy. Everything we truly need is right here, among friends and within ourselves." Paul sighed, feeling a swell of emotions he hadn't expressed in a long time. I thought I needed more," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I wanted to be someone special, someone admired, but all it brought me was loneliness and disappointment." Gertrude nodded, understanding his regret. "Sometimes the more we chase after things that aren't meant for us, the further we drift from what makes us whole," she said gently. "Real wealth, Paul, doesn't come from being above others or living a grand life. It comes from finding joy in the simple, everyday things and being grateful for what we have." She gave him a warm smile. "Humility helps us see the true treasures in life, the kind that no one can take away." Her words, like the old goat's, touched Paul deeply. He had spent so much time longing for admiration that he had overlooked the value of genuine companionship, health, and peace. As Gertrude waddled back to join the other hens, Paul felt a comforting warmth spreading through his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel that restless yearning for more. Instead, he felt a new sense of contentment, the kind that didn't need validation or admiration from others. He looked around the farm with fresh eyes, noticing the small, simple wonders that had always been there, but that he had been too blind to appreciate. The farm was not a place holding him back. It was a home filled with friends, safety, and countless moments of quiet beauty. The gentle breeze brushed against his snout, and Paul closed his eyes, taking in the familiar sounds and smells of his world. For the first time, he understood what Gertrude meant by true wealth. It wasn't about living a grand life or being admired. It was about finding peace within, embracing humility, and appreciating life as it was. From that day forward, Paul embraced his life on the farm with a new outlook. Each morning he woke with a quiet sense of gratitude, no longer bothered by the simplicity of his surroundings. Instead, he found joy in the familiar rhythms of farm life, the morning sun warming his pen, the playful splashes from the ducks, and even the soft clucks of the chickens as they pecked around him. He began to savor his meals, grateful for the food that nourished him and for the steady routine that kept him safe and healthy. As he rekindled his friendships, Paul noticed the change within himself reflected in the way others treated him. The ducks welcomed him back to their morning splashes, the chickens clucked happily at his presence, and the old goat even shared a few more of his stories, pleased to see Paul's newfound contentment. Instead of seeing the other animals as symbols of what he lacked, Paul saw them as companions who enriched his life. He realized they all had something to offer, each in their own unique way. One day, as Paul sat in the shade with Gertrude by his side, she spoke up with a soft chuckle. "You know, Paul, I think you've found something far more valuable than the admiration you once sought." Paul smiled, understanding now what she meant. "I think I was looking for wealth in the wrong places," he admitted, his tone light but filled with sincerity. "It wasn't fame or admiration I needed. It was learning to appreciate what I have and finding happiness in it." With each passing day, Paul found that this sense of gratitude only deepened. The farm no longer felt like a place that limited him. It was a place that offered endless moments of peace and joy, if only he allowed himself to see them. His health, too, began to improve. The dullness that had once clouded his eyes disappeared, replaced by a lively glint. His coat, once neglected, regained its softness and shine, and his appetite returned, making him stronger each day. In embracing his humble life, he felt a lightness in his heart that no amount of luxury could ever provide. As he wandered the farm, his heart swelled with appreciation for each familiar sight. The pond reflecting the afternoon sky, the shady oak that sheltered him, and even the earthy scent of his pen. These things, he realized, were the real riches, the treasures that had always been his, waiting for him to notice. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the farm in golden hues, Paul took a deep breath, feeling truly at home in his skin and his surroundings. No longer driven by the need to prove himself or be someone else, Paul had discovered the simple yet profound joy of living in harmony with himself and his world. And with that, he knew he had found a true wealth, one that required nothing but his own gratitude to appreciate. In the weeks that followed, Paul became known around the farm for his kindness and newfound wisdom. Other animals noticed the warmth in his eyes, the gentle way he spoke, and the contentment that radiated from him. Even the youngest ducklings and chicks would come to Paul, seeking comfort and friendship. He had become not the admired figure he once dreamed of, but a beloved companion who brought peace and joy to those around him. One afternoon, a traveling animal wandered onto the farm, a scrappy fox, lean from his journeys and hardened by a life of roaming. He watched Paul with curiosity, noticing how the other animals gathered around the pig, enjoying his quiet presence and calm spirit. After observing for a while, the fox approached Paul and asked, "What makes you so happy, friend? You live simply, and yet you seem so at peace. Where does that peace come from?" Paul smiled, his eyes gentle. "For a long time I thought happiness came from being admired or having more than others, but I learned that real wealth is about being grateful for what you already have and finding joy in it. Life may be simple here, but it's full of things worth cherishing." The fox, used to a life of struggle and survival, seemed intrigued. "And does it never bother you that you might never see more than this farm? Don't you want more?" Paul chuckled softly. "Once I did. I thought I needed more to be happy. But now I realize that humility and gratitude have given me a greater wealth than anything else could. I don't need to be somewhere else to find happiness, and I don't need to be more than I am. This life as it is enough." The fox pondered Paul's words for a long moment, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. He nodded, then wandered off, seeming lighter than when he had first arrived. And Paul, watching him go, felt a quiet joy in his heart, knowing that he had shared something valuable. As the sun set over the farm that evening, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Paul lay down with a heart full of gratitude. He thought of all the simple things that had brought him joy that day: the fresh morning air, the friendly quacks of the ducks, the soft earth beneath his feet. These things, he realized, had always been his true treasures. Paul had found the wealth he once sought, not in admiration or luxury, but in humility and gratitude. He understood now that happiness wasn't about possessing more, but appreciating the beauty of what was already there. Thank you for listening Paul's story. If this tale inspired you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of life's simple yet profound truths.